And we're pleased to be joined here at the abcnews.com live stream and on the Powerhouse Politics podcast by the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Mr. Scott Pruitt, joining us in studio.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So let's start with this storm. And you can fill us in a little bit on what the EPA's role is on this. But what is the danger level to your mind for this devastation? Obviously, beyond the storm, you've got responsibilities around that. But in terms of the environmental damage that might come afterward.
Well, look, the population centers in Florida, substantial. I mean, the storm that just went through Texas, obviously tremendous impact, tremendous concern there. But this is actually, I think, a little bit larger with respect to the impact on population. So we're looking at many things right now. 80 Superfund sites that we're monitoring all the way from Miami to North Carolina. As you know, those Superfund sites sometimes have lead-related issues or other related concerns that can leak into water supplies that threaten citizens locally. And owners of those facilities have risk management plans and others that they have to implement to ensure. So we're assessing vulnerability now, and then we're communicating with those owners to say, we see some vulnerabilities here. You need to take steps to secure those sites. That's one aspect. Another area that's tremendously important is access to fuel. You know, you've seen the lines in Florida. And this is just a supply and demand situation. As demand increases in these kind of situations, it's substantial. And as you know, with respect to air permits, we have certain blended gasoline in all parts of the country, which creates what? Too much diversification on that fuel and supply concerns. So we just waived those requirements during this period of time to increase access to fuel and supplies of fuel. Governor Scott and I were on the phone twice about that yesterday morning, trying to provide some certainty to the citizens in Florida and along the eastern seaboard. So there's many issues from drinking water to Superfund to debris management, landfills, et cetera, that we're dealing with in this kind of situation.
So this could be a very long-term
recovery
effort.
There's no doubt. I mean, initially it's more monitoring. Initially it's assessing and trying to determine where the vulnerabilities are as best you can, and then the storm hits, and then obviously you assess from that point, and you want to be able to monitor and assess as quickly as possible post the storm so people can get back into their homes and get back into those affected areas to rebuild and restructure.
You know, speaking of monitoring and looking at that damage, there were 13 Superfund sites, as you know, in the Houston area that were flooded or damaged last week after the hurricane. And as of last weekend, it seemed like some inspectors weren't even able to get to some of those sites. Have all of the sites now been reached, and what's the status?
Some of the sites were, in fact, they were monitored. We had aerial assessments going on, and there was constant communication. But yes, those sites are able to be accessed now. There's a first responder safety aspect here. We had our chemical plant, as you know, that was of consequence there in Texas. And a lot of that was the fire marshal there. I was on the phone with the fire marshal quite a bit. They were concerned about sending their folks in to deal with that situation because of the threat to their own personnel. So there's a coordination, and that's what's missed in these storms, I think. The federal response is essential. The federal response is so important, but it's the federal response in conjunction with local and state officials. It truly is a partnership because there's authority, as you know, that's granted to local, state, federal officials. And FEMA, coordinating interagency, federal government, but then us working with local and city, local towns and the state. We embedded, as an example, individuals in cities and towns across Texas in advance of the storm so that we would have real-time response to the mayor of Corpus Christi or what have you to say this is what we're dealing with. And we're doing the same thing in Florida right now.
Okay, I want to ask about that Arkema chemical explosion, but quick, back to the Superfund sites, which we know as the EPA identifies them, they have been polluted, they could contain toxic, dangerous chemicals. I mean, how are you going to guarantee to people in Houston that drinking water is safe, that soil is safe? I mean, that's scary when you think about 13 of these sites flooded.
Yeah, these sites, like all of our Superfund sites, are an absolute priority of the agency. And so what we're doing is going in to determine if there's a threat. We notify those citizens and we evacuate and then we contain, just like in every situation. So we're working with the local officials. One thing to keep in mind, though, with respect to Superfund sites, owners and private, they're responsible. They pay for that. They're responsible for making sure that those sites are secure. Our responsibility is to hold them accountable, and that's what we're doing right now. Working with those owners, working with those Superfund sites to say, you must take these steps to ensure safety and security of drinking water and the rest for citizens in that area. And if there's any concern whatsoever, guess what we do? We deal with it, contain it, and then advise the citizens as a result.
So I'm curious, as you deal with this, and there's a robust federal response that obviously it involves a lot of what the EPA does, You have been very critical of the EPA mission before you became the administrator, and as Attorney General, you're known for suing the EPA. You'd said earlier this year that it was justified for some people to want to eliminate the EPA, and of course we know the president himself has advocated for basically the elimination of the EPA. I'm curious, as you look at things like this, if there's anything changes in your mindset. Is there anything that you've learned in these last 7 months or so on the job that say, well, I didn't realize this, or here is a critical mission, or do you still believe people are justified in saying there shouldn't be an EPA?
Well, I think one context to your the summary that you provided, my perspective, you can go back to 2013, 2012, as I was bringing litigation against the EPA. I said consistently, there's a very important role, a vital role for the EPA. I've never been one to advocate that the EPA should not be in existence or doesn't have a very important role. We have a very important role, and I've said that consistently. What I meant, what I said in that situation is people are justified at times of feeling that way because of the response and the overreach of the last several years in certain areas. But Rick, from my perspective, in this situation, Superfund is an area. We are absolutely the first responders in a general sense to those situations, working with those private partners to make sure that they're responsible for that, and we hold them accountable. So that's a very important role. On drinking water, we have Superfund sites across the country that we have to ensure safe drinking water. East Chicago comes to mind. And to your question, if it's a threat, guess what we do? We work with Governor Abbott in Texas or Governor Scott in Florida, and we take bottled water in, or whatever we have to do to ensure safe drinking water. That's what we do. So there's a very important role for the EPA historically, and particularly in these kinds of situations.
Are there things that you've learned on the job from the scientists you work with, from people at the EPA that give you a different appreciation than you've done on the outside?
Well, I think obviously not having lived through, emergency response in this way. As Attorney General, I dealt with it in different ways, terrorism activities or, coordination with law enforcement officials. But in this situation, the technical expertise of getting in and assessing these sites, something I'm not familiar with, but we've done I think a tremendous job at partnering with TCEQ in Texas, the Council of Environmental Quality, the DEQ in Florida, making sure that they have the technical resources to assess threats that are in existence. That's a very important role that we play. And we have Region 4. The Region 4 administrator is embedded right now in South Florida with this situation. Region 6, Sam Coleman, he and I were on the phone consistently during the last storm. He was embedded with TCQ in Austin as we went through the situation there. That partnership is so important, Rick, and it played out, I think, in a very effective way there in Texas, and we seek to do that in Florida.
One of the specific policies that's been talked about a lot in light of Houston had to do with the EPA's decision to delay implementation of that Obama-era rule.
The RMP.
Right.
Yeah.
That the Irma chemical plant would have had to say exactly how much they
Which
were
they
holding.
still do. They still do.
But are there any regrets or any look
Well, there's no
back?
regrets because, look, there's nothing. What we're doing there is risk management plans are important. Risk management plans are important to citizens in the community. They deserve to know what a chemical plant has on site and the threat that is.
But your agency decided to push back implementation of that.
But it's
that
important
rule.
to note why and in what way. And the way that we have addressed that is because if you have too much information in that RMP that then can inform these chemical plants are terrorist opportunities as well. They present soft targets to terrorists to come in and do something pretty bad in those communities. And so what you've got to do is strike the balance in what's in that RMP so that you're not informing terrorists on helping them have data that they shouldn't have. That was the whole focus and still is the focus. It was never about and isn't about doing away with RMPs or making sure that communities in the area or citizens aren't aware of what they need to know to evacuate or deal with concerns. That never was the focus and still isn't the focus. It was always about what do we put in the RMP to adequately inform our citizens, but also not inform terrorists that might then target those facilities and threaten those citizens in those communities.
So earlier this week, as you may know,
and that RMP plan, to your point, Mary Alice, so important because guess what? During the midst of the Arkema situation, guess what we were able to do? I pulled that RMP, and I looked at what the requirements of the risk management plan, required, and we've begun asking questions. Did they do that? Did they have adequate generation support? Did they have redundancy with respect to those trailers that blew up? We don't know yet. There's some concern that they didn't. There's some concern that they didn't have a primary power source that refrigerated those trailers to keep those chemicals safe and secure, and they didn't have redundancy on top. So we're dealing with it. So those RMPs very much important. I've never been against RMPs. It's the specific aspects of what's in those RMPs that help inform terrorists that we need to be, national security concerns has been the focus.
And dealing with it means holding them to account?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, there are certain steps we can take, Rick, something called a Section 114 letter that we can forward to companies all across the country to say, we need to have more information about this situation because we're concerned perhaps that you didn't take the appropriate steps under your risk management plan. Those things are actually, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but know that those things are being considered.
So earlier this week, on the issue of preparedness for a hurricane, there's a certain prominent Florida resident who has a big radio show. You may have heard of the guy, Rush Limbaugh, who had this.
How long has he been around?
Yeah, up and comer. We're hoping he can be successful.
It's a pretty nascent program.
Yeah, exactly. Take a listen to what he had to say about the emerging threat from Irma.
You can accomplish a lot just by creating fear and panic. You don't even need the hurricane to hit anywhere. All you need is to create the fear and panic accompanied by talk that climate change is causing hurricanes to become more frequent and bigger and more dangerous, and you create the panic and its mission accomplished, agenda advanced.
So he's referring to news media hype on these things. He's also referring in part to government agencies that are part of these forecasts. You're on the inside. Is there hype? Is this about hype around climate change?
I just find it striking, and I actually was talking to somebody yesterday about this. I find it striking in the midst of a storm, getting ready to hit Florida, and access to housing, access to power, access to fuel, very fundamental needs of the citizens of that area that we're trying to assess cause and effect of a storm. No, it's serious. Yeah. There'll be a day and time to talk about that. But to take any attention away from first responders and the things that matter to providing fuel, power, housing, and those kinds of issues to citizens in that state, just like in Texas, I know this. I have to focus my attention, my resources, the focus of the agency on that, because that is most urgent and most important at this point. Does that mean that those questions shouldn't be asked and answered, Rick? Absolutely not. But there's a time and place for those questions to be asked. And for folks to be asking, I'm not talking about you guys. I'm talking about whatever people sitting in wherever in this country and pontificating about what is the cause and effect of the storm. To me, is resources and time that really isn't most essential right now.
Is it harmful to have Rush Limbaugh talking in that way? Do people feel like if you're minimizing the threat of this storm by talking about it in the context of climate change? I don't think.
My comment to you just now is not minimizing or otherwise the storm. It's prioritizing what has to be focused upon by an agency of the federal government to respond to the needs of the citizens of Florida. That's the focus. Now, again, will there be a time and place to perhaps discuss that and debate that? Sure. But not in the midst of the storm, not in the midst of the responses, because there's enough to say grace over right now. We're on the heels, as I was sharing on the way up here. This is two major storms back to back, right? And from a responsiveness, from an agency perspective, it's a challenge to make sure that we get our resources deployed, partnering with those cities and towns in the state of Florida to help serve the citizens there, and that's what our focus is.
Before we let you go, you're a big baseball fan, former second baseman in college.
Yeah. Is Mary Alice, by the way? Because we were talking baseball earlier. Are you a big baseball fan?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Actually, I do have something to add here. My best friend growing up is the director of operations of a minor league baseball team in my hometown.
All right.
Where's that?
Tacoma, Washington.
Oh, yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, so it's a AAA team, if I'm not mistaken. Or what have been.
Let's give us some picks for the playoffs. The Dodgers, Oklahoma City's team has been
the Dodgers have had a great year, but the Diamondbacks right now. I mean, I think if you look at the National League side of the ledger, the Diamondbacks are playing as well, are probably better than anybody in baseball right now. I think it's a National League year. I mean, when you look at the way the MLB season has played out, I think Dodgers, Diamondbacks, obviously going to play well. I'm an American League. When we owned the team in Oklahoma City, we were affiliated with the American League, so I followed the Rangers. That was our parent club. But I just think the strength's going to be on the National League side of the ledger this year.
And you didn't even mention the Washington Nationals in that.
Look, I've been to a few games here, and I'll tell you, very impressive facility. Yeah. I had not had the occasion to spend a lot of time there, and it's a tremendous facility. It's good to see them get some relief pitching, and maybe there's some hope now. But it's a great stadium.
All right. They do a nice job over there. Scott Pruitt from the Environmental Protection Agency. Thanks for being here at Powerhouse Politics. Appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.